Hello, and welcome to this, our 75th live stream, Halloween and other obscure Christian festivals. Tonight's live stream is in honor of Halloween, which is actually a Christian festival. It was first celebrated in the 7th century AD when the Roman pantheon was converted from a massive pagan temple into a church. And it was when that church was christened that they called that All Saints' Day. And it was practiced during, say, the early November time frame throughout most of Europe at least into the 8th century. Now, the confusion of this comes in with the Irish sort of pagan festival of Samhain, which also happens to be roughly on the same day. However, the correlation between Samhain and Halloween is not causation. Halloween has distinctly Christian roots. Samhain was only practiced in, say, Ireland. So there's actually no connection between the pagan festival and Halloween. And almost all the traditions that come out of modern Halloween go back to, say, Christian affectations. So it's a much more Christian holiday than it is a pagan holiday. So anyway, that's what my 2 cents is towards Halloween. Just as a matter of housekeeping business, I should state that I am recovering from a pretty bad case of the flu. So if you hear me cough or sniffle or anything like that, please, be merciful to me. So, with that said, we're going to get into the questions. I also want to remind everyone as well that I have an upcoming debate in roughly a week's time. That's going to be on November 7th at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time on Sean McDowell's channel between myself and Titus Kennedy. We've already worked out the details, so this looks like this is going to be a go. So, very thrilled about this. This is going to be very, very exciting. So anyway, let's get to the questions. It's the same routine as always. Super chats have priorities. No surprise there. We also, if you're going to ask a non-super chat, and we do take non-super chats, we also ask that you only ask the question once and that you put a Q and a colon in front of the question so I know it's being directed to me, because I scan the live chat looking for non-super chats. Usually at the end after all the super chats are done. So I look for those. And if I don't see that Q and colon, I'll just pass by it. The other thing is, if it has to do with a Bible verse or a foreign language, I ask you to give me a little context. In the case of a Bible verse, give me the chapter, the book, and the verse number. If it's for a foreign language, tell me what language it's in. So I got a little bit of, and what you think the word means, so I have a little bit of context to go on. This is just to avoid the confusion of homonyms. So anyway, we're going to get into the questions, and we're going to start off tonight with 4 non-super chats. And actually, I'm going to start off with this. Kevin Vaughn says, party time. What a great way to start. And it's party time. Shabbat shalom, everyone. What a great way to start a Friday. Okay. Our first non-super chat is from AWL. And he asks, why is the syncretism between the Hellenistic and Egyptian pantheons so successful? In most classical cases on set of deities and myths seem to overtake the other in prominence. Okay. Well, it's so successful because many of the gods in the Hellenistic pantheon find analogs in, say, Egyptian pantheons. Now, this is normal for polytheistic systems. Polytheistic systems, will tend to adopt whatever it sees as close. Like, for example, in Semitic peoples inhabit Avaris in the 11th dynasty, they bring with them Baal from Canaan. Well, they're bringing Baal, but the Egyptians say, oh, that's a storm god. We have a storm god too, Seth. Baal, Seth, same thing. And in turn, the Canaanites the Canaanites from the Semites are going to say, hey, Baal looks like Seth. Hey, we're okay worshiping Seth. It's the same thing. Well, the Hellenistic Greeks are going to do the same thing. They're going to look at, say, Thoth and say, oh, that's Hermes. God of knowledge, god of writing, messenger of the gods. Yeah, very similar. They're going to look at and say, oh, king of the gods. Zeus, king of the gods. Same thing. They're going to look at Hathor. They're going to say, Hathor, hey, goddess of love and fertility and procreation. They're going to say, oh, Aphrodite. So they're going to have those similar reactions to both to the Egyptian gods because, they're going to look at the Egyptian gods and see parallels. So this is why the syncretism is so successful, is because there's a very, very similar analogs. And the closer the analog, the more successful the pairing is going to be. This is, for example, why, say, Mesopotamian gods were in some respects less successful in their attempt to enculturate the Egyptians. It's because their gods didn't have similar analogs. You did have a god of the sun, but he was also he was the god of law, too. You had Shemesh. He's not only just god of the sun, but he's the god of laws. Egyptians had no laws. They weren't really a society governed by tradition, not law. So it's like, well, yeah, that god is kind of similar, but it ain't. It ain't the same. So, you did have that issue too, that when the mythologies are so different, so discordant, that the pairing doesn't take place. It's not successful. And we do see that definitely between, say, for example, the Assyrians and the Egyptians. But in the case of the Greeks and the Egyptians, yeah, they're very similar in some cases. So that's why there's that syncretism happening there, because there is that similarity and that concordance also. So I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the question. It was a great question. Okay, the next non-super chat is from Darkblade. See you here tonight. Is it possible to know when the plagues happened? Like, how can we know the 10th plague was in April or late March? Okay. That is actually a really good question. And it boils down to this, is that we do have some chronological information as to what month certain plagues took place. Like, for example, the plague of blood, where the Nile turns to blood. That generally happens when it does happen. And it's a very rare event, but it did happen on more than one occasion in Egypt. It happens at the beginning of the inundation. That's when the water turns color. And that happens in September. Now, for the end of the plague cycle, let's go to Exodus, and I believe it's chapter 9:31 here. I already got it here. And verse 31 says, "Now the flax and the barley were ruined. The barley was in the ear, and the flax was in bud." Now, to understand when the Exodus takes place, this is the key passage. This is the 7th plague, the plague of hail. The hail comes down. It ruins the flax, it ruins the barley, but in verse 32 it says, "But the wheat and spelt were not ruined, because for they had ripened late." Okay? So they're not totally beaten down by the hail. But the flax and barley were at a point where they were at a more mature stage. Now, we understand when the Egyptian agricultural cycles were. So this is how we can narrow it down. The barley harvest was between February and May. The flax harvest is between March and April. So, this seventh plague here had to take place before the flax was mature. So basically before it had gone to seed. So the seventh plague took place probably sometime around February or March. Okay? So then from then, you have the three other plagues that come right after this, including the Passover. So at that point, you're getting to that point of, you're three plagues in. That's gonna mean that the Exodus, the 10th plague, was roughly in April, roughly March, April, or May. And I would say probably April or May. So that's how we generally can estimate when the 10th plague was. And it's based upon the 7th plague. That 7th plague being the destruction of the flax harvest. Because the flax harvest is very precise. It's only within the actual harvest only takes place over 10 days. So it's a very short period of time. But it only happens in the months of March and April. So knowing that, we can figure out the rest. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. It's a great question. Thank you very much for the question. So we can see here that these plagues are taking place over a long period of time, from September to roughly April. Okay, our third question is from the MRB. And he asks, how do the Apkalu inform or challenge your unique interpretation of the Nephilim? Okay, very interesting. My understanding, or at least Walton and Heiser have said, is that they were divine beings. Well, yes and no. We've got two Apkalu. Okay, now, what are the Apkalu? They are a set of sages or wise men that were said to have given the Mesopotamia certain things, like how to build the city of Eridu. Okay. There were 7 Apkalu that were before the flood, and 8 that occurred after the flood. Now, the 7 Apkalu that happened before the flood were said to be demigods. The 8 after the flood were said to be mortal men. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think Heiser and Walton's, I don't know Heiser and Walton's interpretation of the Apkalu per se, but from the legend, the Apkalu have descended from heaven. They're not Nephilim in the same sense as Walton and Heiser have suggested, because they were demigods that descended from heaven. Nephilim, in at least the Heiserian sense, were the product of the sons of God, angels, or spiritual powers, and mortal humans. They weren't from heaven. They were from earth. Semi-divine beings, but of an earthly origin. I think that the Apkalu of legend are from heaven. And there's only 7 of them. Okay? These are special instances of demigods. As unique as Hercules is to, say, Greek legend. Now, in the case of the Apkalu after the flood, that fits totally fine with what I say. Because if these are Apkalu in the sense of, say, mortal men that were, say, endowed with special abilities based upon the breaking of the Naditum vow, that's totally consistent with, say, post-flood, the post-flood, Nephilim. It's also even consistent with the pre-flood in the sense that, these still could have been mortal men that were just, say, deified through legend, through myth. So I don't see this as a challenge to my view. And frankly, Heiser could even say this as well, that basically, Heiser could say, the Mesopotamians here were mistaken in that they came from heaven. They were earthly bound, of the angels. So I don't think this really challenges anyone's particular view in particular, because in some way the Apkalu legend is mistaken in one way or the other. It's either mistaken in that these Apkalu, the pre-flood Apkalu, were from heaven, or they're mistaken in that they were demigods. So one way or the other, there's a mythological error happening here. So I don't think it actually really informs our decision. Even if you think that these are Nephilim, there's too few of them. There's 15 of them. That's not enough to sort of bring the wrath of God crashing down on the whole world. Because, we get the sense from Genesis that the Nephilim were numerous. So, I don't think this is really... It's interesting. It's an interesting mythological side note, but I think that's about all it is. So, anyway, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. The Apkalu are interesting. They're basically wise men dressed like fish, essentially. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You see them in portraiture. They're in iconography. They look like they're wearing a fish skin. Head of the fish on top of the head. Scales down the back, tail down at the feet. Oh yeah, it's a ride. It's a hoot. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, let's get to the next one. Warrior of the Most High. What do you think of Paradise Lost as a piece of literature? I think it's a fantastic piece of literature. It's probably one of the greatest pieces of literature of the early modern period. And is it a good source to understand the Bible? No. I'll have to study it anyway, since it's part of my honors degree program. Okay, here's what it is. It is a poetic interpretation from the 17th century. It's excellent. It's as far as literature goes, it is truly an excellent work. I've read the Paradise Lost. I loved it. I think it was a really well done, really excellent piece of literature. And he does have theological insights, like any poetry. Poetry can convey theological insights, and I think there are some theological insights. Like, for example, Milton does capture the pride of Satan, the absolute unrelenting pride of him, and you do get a sense of grandeur from the poem that is incredible. But it also, it's not, because this is poetry, you're not supposed to quite take the idea that that this is supposed to be literal either. There is a lot of poetic license here. The fact, like, for example, when Satan in Paradise Lost says, "It is better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven." Well, there's a theological error there. Nobody is ruling in hell. Now, Milton sort of bypasses the theological truth that not even Satan's going to be ruling in hell. And unfortunately, many people have sort of taken that and basically gone on to say, "Oh, the demons are ruling in hell." They're not ruling in hell. No. They're captives alongside everyone else. They're your cellmates. They're not ruling. They're not the wardens. Okay? So you do have to be careful with Milton. Milton is doing it from a particular poetic understanding, but it's not a theological discourse. It's not a theological treatise. But it is great literature. And as long as you understand it as great literature and not necessarily biblical truth, I think it's a wonderful thing to study. It's a great work of literature. And as I said, I really enjoyed reading it. Very, very, very interesting poetic form. Brilliant, too. I mean, it's absolutely a brilliant work. So anyway, that's my thoughts on Paradise Lost. Thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. Not one we've gotten before either, so very good. I mean, it's a very interesting question. Okay, now we're on to the super chats. Our first super chat is from Allayco for 50 Swedish kroners. Thank you very much for the super chat. Greetings, Dr. Mrs. Falk. All Hallows Day is here. Cobras combat cancer curses. How did Egyptians die at what age? Ooh. Well. Well, the vast majority of Egyptians died by infection. Pure and simple, infection was the number one killer in Egypt. If it didn't get you at childbirth, because remember, infant mortality is super high. One of the leading causes to death is postnatal infection. This was one of the reasons why most Egyptians didn't live past the age of 2. And that's just because infant mortality was just so incredibly high. And most of the causes of that was infection. Okay. But you had the typical causes of death. But if you made it past 2, you probably lived at least into your 30s, possibly into 40s, up even into your 60s and 70s. There are some Egyptians that live to incredibly long ages. So, when we look at, say, causes of death in Egypt, if you were part of the warrior class, yeah, okay, combat might be, injury. In fact, probably more people in combat roles in Egypt died from accident than from combat. That's still true. Like, for example, if you're a chariot rider, you were more likely to be killed by being thrown from your chariot than dying in combat. And this happened frequently, where a chariot would tip and you'd get thrown. And then you'd break bones, get infections, and die. Death by cobras was very rare. It's still rare. Part of the reason why is the Egyptian cobra tends to prefer rats. That's the major food of Egyptian cobras, is rats. So cobra bites were very rare in Egypt, and still are very rare in Egypt. Now, if you open a nest of cobras by accident and 30 of them swarming in there and you make them mad, yeah, okay, yeah, you're going to get bit. But the venom of Egyptian cobra is not particularly potent. So people didn't typically die all that often from cobras unless they were already in a weakened state. Farming accidents, common. Plague. There was some plague back then, a lot of infectious disease. And we do find evidence of also, say, cancer. Again, infections still number one. Through all causes of mortality. Whether that's infection caused by injury. There's several cases of infection through dental abscess that kills them. Yes, a dental abscess can kill you. So there's a lot of causes of death. We do find, again, cases of cancer as well. So yeah, that's how the Egyptian population typically lived and died. Injury, infection, disease, generally. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that answered your question. Very much appreciated. What? Yeah, death by cobra would have been sexier, but very uncommon. Very uncommon. Okay, Our next super chat is also from Allayco for 50 Swedish kroners again. Thank you very much for the super chat. Shrink School lore put Egyptian healers in 3 tiers. Low, who healed with the knife. Mid, who healed with the herbs. High, who healed with words. Any truth to it? Now, I had to look up what Shrink School was. From what I gather, this is the Jukusho Gakuen. It's a freeware Japanese game. I haven't played the game myself. So, I don't know much about this game. So I have to admit a certain amount of ignorance here. However, but what I can say, for example, of healers in ancient Egypt is that they used all these methods. Healers in Egypt would use scalpels when necessary. They would heal with herbs when necessary. They also used incantations along with the scalpel and the herbs. Okay? So, it wasn't a one or the other. They did all of it. This was part of sort of a comprehensive practice of medicine that you find in ancient Egypt. If you want to see a lot more detail on this, I would suggest reading the Edwin Smith papyrus, where it goes through all sorts of cures for various things, and you'll see, like, for example, if it's a cyst, they'll cut it out. Which is what a doctor today would do, essentially, with it. If it's something that is an infection, they might use herb concoction and say, okay, chant this spell while taking it. So, there wasn't a separation of classes here based upon technique. They did it all. They did all of this. They left no technique unused. Whether prayer, a magical spell, herbal concoction, or say surgical intervention. They did it all. So, the short answer is there's no truth to what Shrink lore says, but Shrink School lore, but there's also this planety of techniques that they are using. So anyway, I hope that answered the question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Our next super chat is from Jonathan Cinnamon for, I think that is 70. I think that's South African. ZAR? You know what that currency is? I think that's South African. Or is that Zambian? ZAR, though. What currency is that? Okay, South African Rand. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And he goes, sorry, I think I misspoke your name. Johan Snyman. Johan Snyman. Okay, I gotta make sure I get the name right here. Okay, and he says, hi, Dr. Falk. Well, hello. I have a hard time articulating to non-Christians and colleagues why I believe it's wrong to say OMG or Jesus Christ if you are surprised, angry, etc. And then he continues, I understand Christians and non-Christians obviously have different views on being okay with saying these things. Any advice? Apologies, I couldn't fit everything into the super chat. Well, that's fine. Yeah, actually, I do have some advice here. Be chill. Okay? Be chill. It might be wrong. It might be offensive. And frankly, when they do it, the big thing here is it's not that it's not one of. I mean, people use, say, the second commandment as basically saying you shouldn't take the Lord God's name in vain. So you shouldn't say OMG or Jesus Christ in a impious manner. That's really just a really small. That's almost a peccadillo of what that commandment actually means. That commandment is actually referring to people who take on Christ as their personal deity and then act in an unbecoming way. Okay, so that's what that commandment really means. The whole idea of it also referencing, say, using, say, the Lord's name inappropriately is sort of not exactly the point of the verse. So I think it's really important to make that differentiation here between what, say, the second commandment is saying and what is just being respectful. The whole idea, the whole reason Christians don't take God's name in vain or Jesus Christ's name in vain is because it's disrespectful. Okay? You can't expect an unbeliever to be to have any sort of respect for God or Jesus Christ. They're not going to be respectful. And my advice here is just, every time they do it, pray for them. Pray for them. Don't sort of bring it out to them. Don't tell them, why you hate it. That's just, that's sort of like waving a red flag in front of a bull. You're just going to annoy him. This is just sort of how, this is the art of wisdom, of what the Hebrews would call hakmah. Living peaceful with your unbelieving neighbor. Don't flaunt your holiness to others. Just if they do this, don't react. Don't be surprised. They're pagans. They're heathens. Of course they're going to do this. So, but it does show you their need for prayer. So to use that as an opportunity to pray for them, not out loud. Don't be foolish about this. But pray for them silently. Pray for them silently. You'll be surprised how things change. Be respectful. Be respectful to their beliefs. Their belief is that they don't believe in God. Their belief is they don't believe in Jesus Christ. You don't have to. You don't have to. You don't have to articulate that this. There's nothing necessary that you have to convey why you find this offensive. Yes, I'm not doubting it's offensive. That's not the point here. The point is, how do you do this with wisdom and skill so that you don't sound like a fundamentalist clown? Okay? Because when it does come time to you having to have a serious discussion of the gospel, and that might happen. You never know when God's going to lead somebody to talk about the gospel in a serious way. They have to respect you enough to have that conversation. If they know you don't use those words yourself, but at least you don't react negatively when they do, they might be comfortable enough to have that conversation with you. That can be much, much more important in the great providential plan of God than correcting them on their speech today. And admittedly, some people you will end up praying for a lot because they have a potty mouth. Okay? So that's the best advice I can give you here, is not to correct them. Don't do it yourself. Don't join in. But don't correct them either. Pray for them. Be the light. Okay? Be the salt, be the light. But, don't go out of your way to be an insufferable prig either. Okay? So, too often those discussions can, we're talking about here something that's exceptionally minor here. Yeah, okay, it's blasphemy, but okay. it can be very, very in the big scope of things. This is not something that may be helpful in the long term if you correct them on saying why it's wrong to say OMG or Jesus Christ in an impious way. Okay? So I hope that helped. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. And I hope you come back for other questions too, because it's a good question. It's a good question. It's a question of orthopraxis. How shall we live? It's a great question. It's a wonderful question. And I think we need to take more lessons from this. So thank you very much for the super chat and the question. Very much appreciate that. Okay, our next super chat here is from Mouthwash for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. The Elephantine papyri don't mention anything demonstrably about from the Hebrew law, prophets, or Moses, nor the events around the Jerusalem temple, despite asking help for their own rebuilding. Why is this? Okay. First of all, most of the Elephantine papyri are quite late. Generally, they're 2nd to 3rd centuries BC. There's a few that are like 4th century. None of them really sort of get into the 5th or 6th century. So several generations have already passed by the time these papyrus start getting written. Now, in some respects, we do have some of the Psalms recorded in the Elephantine papyrus, or at least fragments of the Psalms. So we do know that there is a connection between Elephantine and the Israelites. We also know that there is a temple of Yahweh there, and we do see Yahweh's names. We in the Elephantine papyri, we do find Baal names, and the worship of Balat. We also find in the Elephantine papyri mention of the temple of Yahweh there at Elephantine. Okay? So how do we take all this data? How do we take all this data? Well, one of the things we have to realize is, again, it's several generations after the Gedaliah incident, where they assassinate the Babylonian governor Gedaliah and have to run. And they run really, really deep into Egypt, as far as they can. Some of them stop at Pelusium and get clobbered. But others go all the way as far as they can, which is Elephantine. Elephantine is the place you run when you never want to come back. It's really far away. So once they're at Elephantine, they have to set up their own community. They have to make their work. Have to make jobs for themselves. We do find the remains of the Temple of Yahweh at Elephantine. Okay, there's not much left of it today. There's only like a little bit of a back wall that remains. But we do find that there is a remnant. I actually have a picture of that remnant, or at least a picture from the distance. You can really only see it actually from bottom of the cliff face. So it's really hard to even get a good picture of now, because so little of it remains. That whole side cliff has just collapsed in the last 100 years, which is really unfortunate, because when it was first excavated, there was a lot more left of it. So very little left of that temple, which is very, very unfortunate, because it would have been really wonderful to say go back and re-excavate that. But we do know that they were mercenaries, that they worked as mercenaries, especially during, say, the late period. They were, during the Persian period, they were mercenaries more or less. But they did retain their language, which wasn't Hebrew. but at this point, we're talking the Babylonian period. They're mostly speaking Aramaic. So most of these papyri are in Aramaic. So a lot of what we find in those papyri are Aramaics. I mean, Imperial Aramaic, that sort of thing. So even though the texts themselves don't explicitly mention, say, Torah, prophets, Moses, we do know that it's a continuation of Israelite culture, in as much as these people had left Israel and occupied Elephantine in the late 6th, early 5th century. So that much is pretty clear at this point. I don't think anyone can really argue against that. But again, by the time these papyri are written, they've already got their own temple. They're already doing their own rituals. The whole law, prophets, Moses, that's just being carried on orally at this point. So again, these are not priests that abandoned. These were basically soldiers, insurrectionists. So anyway, I hope that answers your question. That again, what did they leave with? I mean, they left in a hurry. So it's not like they're taking Torah scrolls with them. So they're basically picking up what they can, their families, and they're running. Because they're afraid of Nebuchadnezzar. And rightfully so. Although they were told to stay. And that they would be given mercy. But they didn't listen to the prophet. They ran. So that's what happened. They went to Elephantine, and they fell into aberrant Yahweh worship. And ultimately, the temple there was destroyed, and the population there was either assimilated or dispersed. So I thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Our next super chat is from Billy Ningen for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Good evening, Dr. Falk. What is your recommendation for studying oral history, oral tradition? Ooh. I wish I could answer that. And the reason why I wish I could answer that is I've got a personal bibliography, of about 30 volumes on oral tradition that I want to read and haven't had the chance to yet. We have to understand that, like, in the last 20 years, there's been a huge explosion of literature done on studying oral tradition and oral history. Lots of work have been done on this. It's one of the hottest topics right now in anthropology. Really, really hot topic. And on my reading list, I'll never get to read everything on my reading list. That's what heaven's for. I want God's library. Man, if I had time to read everything I wanted to read, I mean, I would be spending a lot of my week reading. I wish I had more time to read, because there's a lot of stuff on my reading list that would address questions like yours here. Because there's actually, as I said, a lot of great research that's happening. For example, they're discovering that oral tradition, oral history isn't static. It changes. And it changes in some predictable ways. And this is fascinating. This is one of the things I find really, really fascinating about the recent studies in oral tradition. Is that, for example, actions like verbs will stay more consistent and more constant as far as their meaning than nouns. Nouns will sort of change with almost every generation. And every retelling of oral history, changes the nouns. For example, because the words themselves of nouns, the concrete objects, will change more rapidly than, say, the underlying verbs. So that's very interesting all by itself. Like, for example, you go, in North America here, you go to a grocery store and you buy a package of buns. Go to England. Well, you got baps, buns, rolls. A dozen different words for what's essentially a bun. So, but this is the way language works. It tends to diversify over time and change. So when we talk about oral tradition, as words start changing over time, so does the underlying meaning. So we do find that oral tradition is not necessarily static. In some ways it can be very concrete and very static. In other ways, it can change very dynamically. But we're only starting to realize this now with the study of oral tradition. But again, I've got a huge queue of books I need to read myself on this. So I can't recommend something here because I haven't read them myself. So I'm going to have to defer the answer to this until I get that copious amount of free time that never seems to materialize, where I can do that reading myself. So I thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay, the next one is from Billy Mingan for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Are there non-believing scholars who are maximalists? William G. Deaver did defend some events in the Bible, Judges, ancient Israel and Judah, Semitic sojourn in Egypt, etc. What's your opinion? Well, William Deaver is not really a maximalist and he's not really a minimalist. He's sort of in between now. It's also going to depend on what you mean by non-believing. Non-believing as a Christian, non-believing as a Jew, non-believing as an atheist. I'm not sure. I mean, there might be maximalists, because you see, here's the thing: the maximalist minimalist thing isn't necessarily tied to faith. Now, oftentimes it does seem to fall down on lines of belief. Like, for example, if somebody is a believing scholar, they tend to be more often maximalist. But there's also minimalists, too, that are believers as well. Okay? There's many, many people who hold to a personal faith, but, they're in their professional life, they're much more minimalist, like Mark Smith. He's much more minimalist than he is yet he's a Roman Catholic believer. So, are there minimalists that are believers? Yes. Are there minimalists that are non-believers? Yes. It's both. And the same goes with maximalism too, because they're not mutually exclusive categories. Maximalism and minimalism tends to be what is your approach to any particular text more than it is to what your faith propositions are. Like, for example, you could be, a maximalist in regards to the Exodus and be a complete naturalist. There's nothing inconsistent about that position. Nothing at all. So what you would have here really is going to depend upon what what axes they have to grind, more or less. If they're grinding, say, a naturalist axe, if they're against naturalism, they're probably going to be maximalist. If they're grinding an anti-biblical axe, they're probably going to be minimalist. If they are naturalists, they could go either way. It really, really is going to depend. Really. So, would that be biblical mediumists? Actually, a lot of them are. To be honest, probably the mass majority are in the mushy middle here, between maximalism and minimalism. Most scholars today are going to be sort of in the middle between the two positions. And to be honest, too, maximalism has become more minimalist, and minimalism has become more maximalist, and it gets kind of messy. It really gets messy. So, and Deaver is in that mushy middle. He is in that mushy middle. So it really is going to depend. As I said, you're going to get some scholars who are maximalists that are, that don't believe. You're going to get some believing scholars who are minimalists because they compartmentalize their religion from their work. So it's really just going to really depend. Do I know any off the top of my head? Not off the top of my head. I know, but it depends again what you mean by non-believing. That's also going to hugely depend here. I have heard of some, say, non-believing scholars that are maximalists, but maximalists in some respects, not others too. So, again, really going to depend. Okay. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And this next one from Billy Ningen for $20. It seems to be a continuation on the last one. William G. Deaver also argued that God of Abraham, Isaac, and Egypt is not Yahweh because the narrative uses El, which has late Bronze Levantine context. You Garrett Canaan, what are your thoughts? I sort of agree with him, but not for that reason. Okay. Here's where I kind of agree with him. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob encountered God, but he was not identified as Yahweh. He would have been identified as El Shaddai, El Elyon. There are various forms of El, and El just means God. Yahweh does seem to originate from, say, Midian, and is brought back by Moses as basically the identification, the name of the God to whom Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob owed their allegiance. So Deaver is right in this respect that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are not explicitly worshiping Yahweh, even though, say, Genesis retrospectively refers to it as Yahweh. Even out of the words out of the mouth of Abraham, says he's worshiping, he identifies him as Yahweh, but at the same time too, Yahweh is not in that sort of historical milieu. That does seem to be a retrojection that's written by the Mosaic author, Moses. Okay, just be clear, Moses. And Moses does this frequently. Is he uses retrojective terms when he's recording, say, stuff in Genesis. So that's not uncommon at all. Again, it is to make the reader identify El with Yahweh. So those are my thoughts on this. Is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were worshiping El Shaddai, El Elyon, but they didn't know it was Yahweh yet. This God had the characteristics of Yahweh, but it's really not until the revelation of Moses at Mount Sinai, at Mount Horeb, that El reveals himself to be Yahweh. Well, I hope that explains this. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated, and I hope that helped. Our next super chat is from Billy Ningen again for $20. Thank you very much for the super chat. What was the fate of the Hyksos when they left Avaris? Was this the, quote, first Exodus, end quote? How do we know that is, quote, Israel consisted of mostly people that joined the Exodus and not indigenous Canaanites? God bless you, Dr. Falk. Okay. I think the first two are kind of the easiest ones to answer. What happened to the Hyksos when they left Avaris? Okay. When the Hyksos left Avaris, it was really only the leadership. It wasn't the full people. Most of the people at Avaris got left behind. It was basically the leadership that basically filled the carts full of goodies and hightailed it out of town. Basically packed up their stuff and left. Now they take the road of Horus, and they hole up at Gaza. Okay, they make their last stand at Gaza. So they're taking that northern Sinai that would later become a fortified road. But back in the days of the Hyksos, it wasn't fortified, not by Egyptians anyway. So they hightail it all the way to basically the coastal plain. And it's at Gaza where they make their last stand. 3 years later, Ahmose I goes all the way to Gaza and destroys it. He destroys Gaza. Okay? That's the end of the Hyksos. They're no more after that. That's they're kaput. They're finished. So there's no relationship between the Hyksos and the Israelite Exodus. So while there have been those writers that have tried to compare the Hyksos Exodus with the Israelite Exodus, they're not related. They are separated by hundreds of years. They don't even go to the same location. The Hyksos go to the coastal plain. The Israelites go around Israel, enter through the eastern side into the Judean foothills. And basically, they're occupying the Judean foothills. Okay? So, that gets you get to your third question here. Because what happens to the Hyksos? They're destroyed. They're killed. What happens? Is this the first Exodus? No, not really. It's a Exodus, but it's not an Exodus related to the Israelites. Your third question: how do we know that the Israel consisted of mostly of people that joined the Exodus and not indigenous Canaanites? That is because we have essentially a radical shift in the population, both in their material culture, their dietary habits, and their construction habits. Now, if it would be very, very odd, if these were just indigenous Canaanites, that you didn't just have Canaanite culture continuing on everything normal. Okay? Because if these are indigenous Canaanites, they would be continuing in Canaanite culture, with their Canaanite cities, in their Canaanite houses, using their Canaanite potteries, eating their Canaanite pigs. Okay? But that's not what we see in the material culture. What we see in the material culture is all over the Judean foothills and spreading out across Israel, with the exception of the coastal plain, is we see new settlements with four-room houses. Okay. These are new in Canaan, but we also find them at Avaris. And Avaris is, the Semites that are living in Avaris, they're using these four-room houses. We don't see them again anywhere else until back in Canaan in these new late 13th, early 12th century new settlements. We also find the arising of Israelite burnished ware. And they're no longer eating pig. They don't find the Canaanite pigs, to be of interest. They didn't eat pig in Avaris, and now they're not eating pig in Canaan. So that's how we know that, say, the conquest is of mostly from an external source, is the material culture is different, and it's radically different. Now, with that said, the Israelites did intermarry with the Canaanites. The Bible tells us this. Okay. The Bible tells us they're told not to do it, and then they disobey and go ahead and do it anyway. So, the Israelites are not the most obedient people on the planet. So we do have this where, the conquest is mostly Israelite. It's not the peaceful infiltration that, say, modern scholars love to purport. They're coming and they're taking over Canaanite cities. They're eating Canaanite food, using initially Canaanite houses, then knocking them down and building Israelite houses. They start using their cutlery, and then as their cutlery breaks, they make new ones in their own way. And they're eating kosher. They're eating kosher, at least from the mid-12th century onward. Well, that's pretty telling. And almost everyone here agrees that that's the beginning of Israelite society. So then it only comes down to, where that Israelite society comes from. We do at least, at the very, very least, have a strong correspondence between that early Israelite culture in Canaan and the culture at Avaris 40-ish years earlier. Very strong correspondence there. So, that's probably our best evidence to say that these are mostly Israelites. Because they're spread out. This isn't just the Levites. This is not just the Levites here. Because they're everywhere. It's dozens of settlements. It's like 50, 60 settlements. It's an explosion of settlements. So, and new settlements too. New settlements. So, I think it's pretty clear just from the cultural change that this can't be indigenous Canaanites. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated, and I hope that answered your question. Let's see this. The camel apart, filthy Canaanite pigs being eaten and what have you. Yeah, well, pig is yummy. I like pig. But the early Israelites did not care for pig. Go figure. Okay, our next super chat. Let's see where we are here. Nope. There we are. Mouthwash for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Did the Samaritans, right? Samaritans claim in Antiochus IV's time to have only recently received Sabbath from the Jews. Can't find anything on this alleged statement. Well, and you probably will not find the Samaritans claim this. I believe, and I don't quote me on this because it's been a long time since I looked at this. This was a forged Jewish document. Okay, this was a forged Jewish document against the Samaritans. Okay, and I don't remember what the document was because it's been so long since I've looked at this. So you're not going to find this in a Samaritan document. Not in a Samaritan document. Now, we kind of have to understand what is the origin here of the Samaritans. The Samaritans are actually, they date back to around the late 8th century BC. When the northern kingdom of Israel is conquered by the Assyrians have a deportation program. Basically, they wanted to break up the clan structure. They knew that it was likely that if the clan structure remained in northern Israel, they would have had insurrection on their hands. Now, this was true wherever the Assyrians conquered. So this wasn't only Israel. Okay, any place they conquered, if they saw a clan structure, any sort of family unit larger than the nuclear family, they would deport everyone else. Okay, so a clan being made of several clades and families, they would deport everyone all over the Assyrian Empire. And likewise, they would also import people from other countries into the northern kingdom of Israel. So what ended up happening was you had in northern Israel this blend of people, basically native Israelites and people imported from other holdings of the Assyrian Empire, wherever they had conquered. And those people intermarried, and they became the Samaritans. They essentially held to a kind of Jewish law. They had the Torah. But because they're not coming out of the Babylonian exile, like, say, the Judahites, when the Judahites get conquered by Nebuchadnezzar has his own deportation program. And he's not going to worry about the Samaritans because they're already blended out. But Nebuchadnezzar is going to take the Judahites. He's going to take 10% of their population, the best 10%, and deport them to Babylon. Likewise, what's going to happen is, after the Babylonian exile, a whole lot of scripture is going to come back to Israel. Yes, already, during, the divided monarchy, between northern Israel and, Judah, you're already going to get, the major prophets being written. But all those major prophets are being collected and preserved in Judah, not with the northern tribes. So the northern tribes are going to have Torah. They're going to have Torah. They're going to have Sabbath. They're going to have the Torah law. They're not going to have the rest of the prophets. And they're not going to have, the later books like Kings and Chronicles, etc. Even the Psalms they're not going to have. So, you got a whole lot of various things that's going to happen here. Now, I see another comment here from Mouthwash, where he brings up, 2 Kings 17:4. Let's just take a quick look at that. 2 Kings 17. But the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hosea and had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and so had to offer no tribute to Syria as he had done. So the king of Israel shut him up, bound him into prison. Verse 5, then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land and went up to Assyria and Samaria and besieged in 3 years. The Shalmaneser the third. I don't remember which I can look at, though. Just see here. Yeah, I don't think that's the right passage either. (24) King 17:24. Okay, and the king of Syria brought men from Babylon, from Kuhath, and from Ava, and Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled in cities of Samaria in the places of the sons of Israel. So they just possessed Samaria and lived in the cities. Yeah. That's pretty much it. Pull up another resource here just a second. Try to get the and let's see here. House of David. Yeah, Hosea is the last king. Israel is conquered by Tiglath-Pileser the third. It's not that one. This one. Shalmaneser the fifth. Shalmaneser the fifth that actually conquers the northern kingdom of Israel. Okay. So it's Shalmaneser the fifth that actually conquers Israel. So, but what's going to happen is over time, this sort of the Samaritans are going to have their own version of the Pentateuch, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the Judahites are going to have their version, and they're not going to be hugely different. There's just going to be some small differences between them, but this is going to cause some tensions. Like, for example, the site of the Holy Mountain. You know, the Samaritans are going to say it's Mount Gerizim. The Israelites are going to say it's Mount Zion. So the site of Holy Mountain, this is going to cause some real contention, especially during the time of the Maccabees. And this is where we start seeing these forgeries come out. Where, say, in an anti-Samaritan polemic, Jews who had returned from the Babylonian exile are basically going to say the only valid worship here is in Jerusalem. And we're going to see this sort of tit for tat go on for a very, very long time, over centuries. This tit for tat goes on for centuries, even into the time of Christ. Say the Syro-Phoenician woman, basically Samaritan. She's Samaritan. And she asks Christ, your people, the Jews, say we have to go worship in Jerusalem. My people say Mount Gerizim. Which one's right? And Jesus goes, the time is coming when neither will worship at either mountain, but all will worship in spirit and truth. So this is a long-standing conflict. And there are forgeries, there are allegations, there's even some bloodshed over this. So I'm not surprised you can't find it, but I think it is out there. But you're gonna have to probably dig into some of the say more of the polemical literature here on the Jewish side, not so much on the Samaritan claims. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay, our next super chat is from Cambrip for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Is it true that initially the Septuagint only included the books of Moses, and if so, when was the rest translated? Thanks and God bless. Well, thank you and God bless you also. Yes. Yes, it is true that the Septuagint only included the first 5 books of Moses, but it also wasn't finished at that point either. So when the Septuagint was first released, it did have, it was only the Pentateuch, but they quickly added on the prophets, as basically it was a comprehensive model of translation. So they included as much stuff as they could into this. So they quickly added Joshua and Judges, and then they added, say, a lot of the prophets and the histories. Basically, the Navaim and the Kativim, prophets and the writings. They also then added some Apocrypha too. So it was a very comprehensive approach. They weren't trying to do, say, an authoritative translation here. They were trying to do a unabridged translation. So that's why sometimes you'll also find, say, some of the books of the Septuagint being longer than their Masoretic counterparts, is because they're thrown in the kitchen sink. This is kind of, how do I say it? This is, what would be a good way? What was that version of the Bible that had every translation in it? Amplified. Think of it as kind of like the Amplified Greek version. Okay. Okay. Yeah, it was really sort of an amplification, where they would try to take as many of the texts that they had and sort of cram it all together into a translation that is at least, and it seems to be from what we can tell from the Septuagint, that they were working from multiple manuscripts. And they were, which is, and honestly, a step up from the King James, but we won't get into that little rabbit hole there. But the translators of the Septuagint seem to have had multiple manuscripts, and they seem to have some very old manuscripts too. So when one manuscript tended to be longer than another, they tended to include that extra material. So they were aware of that there were problems in, say, between manuscripts. They were aware that that there were differences in versions, and they would sort of harmonize the two. So I do think the Septuagint is very, very much sort of an amplified Greek version. So that process of including the rest of the books took place over 2 centuries roughly. So you had your first you had the first 5 books being translated around the 3rd century BC, and then the rest of it by the early 1st century BC. So that's sort of when they're wrapping up the translation efforts at that point. And that's when they're doing say the deuterocanonical works, the Apocrypha at that point. So that's why you'll get some differences between versions of the Septuagint as well. It's because by the time those last books of the Septuagint are being translated, there's already been some change in the earlier Septuagint works, so that now you have multiple versions of the Septuagint. So anyway, I hope that explains it. Thank you very much for the super chat. I very, very much appreciate it, and I hope that answers your question. Okay, now we're on to the Twidget stuff. Let's see here, what's the next super chat? Okay. Okay, we got another one here from Billy Ningen for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Do you think we have more freedom, less dogmatics in biblical studies and in ancient Near Eastern history in secular universities than Christian institutions? Ah. Wow. That's a loaded question. Whoa. Yes and no. Okay. Yes and no, and I'm going to qualify that. I'm going to qualify that a lot. In some ways, you have more academic freedom in Christian institutions. Some, qualify that, some Christian institutions than secular institutions. Okay? At the same time, too, you also have more freedom in secular institutions, dogmatically, than you do in some Christian institutions. It's all going to depend on the institution. Okay? I will say this. I had a lot of academic freedom. And we're talking here, what we're talking about here is academic freedom. Okay? Ultimately, we're going to be like, for example, when we talk about, say, freedom, we're talking about freedom to express opinions, beliefs, that sort of thing. I had a lot more academic freedom at Liverpool than I did at Toronto. Okay? Lot more freedom at Liverpool. Liverpool did not care about my religious persuasions one way or the other. They did not care. Couldn't have cared less. Okay? If I believed, I believed. If I didn't, they didn't care either. They just didn't care. There's actually a lot of academic freedom when they don't care. I don't know if that's still true today. From what I've heard, things have gotten a lot more woke. But at the time I went there, a lot more freedom in Liverpool. Did not have much freedom at all at Toronto. University of Toronto was very doctrinaire. It was a very hard secularist environment. Okay? Very, very secularist. I had almost no freedom there. Now, some of that was because of their bad. They had some students, some Christian students that were at the University of Toronto who were quite obnoxious about their faith. And I'm not going to mention who those were. Okay? I do know some of them by name. But so I'm very, very much I'm going to be very, very cautious here about who I name and who I don't on this one. But it did leave a bad taste in their mouth, and as such, they legitimately bad taste in their mouth. And as such, there was not much academic freedom, at least for people of faith, at the University of Toronto. Now, at the same time, too, when I was at, say, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, they had their doctrinal, proclivities. But at the same time, too, nobody ever forced them on you. If you had alternate opinions, if you had good justification, they kind of allowed it. It was scholarship. It was more scholarship than dogmatics. Now, I also know that there are institutions out there that are very dogmatic and very rigid, and that will bounce your butt out of school if they figure that you're not towing the doctrinal line. So, it's going to depend on the institution. Mileage will vary. At some secular institutions, you'll find incredible freedom. Incredible freedom. At some Christian institutions, you'll find incredible freedom. At some secular institutions, you'll find very little freedom. And the same can be said to some Christian institutions as well. Very little freedom. It's going to depend, ultimately. And it's sometimes very hard to predict which one's going to give you the freedom and which one isn't. Some that sound very free on the surface are very rigid. Exceptionally rigid. Others that seem very rigid are actually very incredibly tolerant of all sorts of stuff. So again, it's going to depend. Mileage will vary. So, ultimately, yeah, it's going to depend. Not a helpful answer, and not one that you can. I mean, you just can't paint this with a broad brush. It's a complex issue. It's a complex issue. Experiences will vary. You know, even between student to student, the experiences will vary here, because various students are going to have various different views walking into this than not. So, and I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. Next super chat is from the Camelopard for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. Why does Yeshua never call Miriam mother? I don't know. Good question. I've never thought about that. It's an interesting question, isn't it? Yeah, he says it. He does refer to his Miriam as his mother. He never does it through direct address. Like, for example, in direct address, he calls her woman. Like at the Feast of Cana, he says, "Woman, it's not my time yet." But he does refer to her as his mother. Like, like on the cross when he's talking to John, he says to John, "Behold your mother," and says to Mary, "Behold your son." Basically, take care of your mother in my place here. Take care of my mother in your place here. Okay, so you do have that. But I don't understand. I mean, I don't know why he never uses it as direct address. I think some of it is to prevent the confusion between his use of Abba. I think that's some of it. Like, for example, Abba is the Aramaic meaning father. It's very clear that he never calls Joseph father either. Never calls Joseph father. He only calls God in heaven father. So I think some of this might be to prevent confusion that there's a heavenly mother when there isn't. And that would have, this would be a boundary on the Theotokos, essentially. And again, probably the best description I've found of the Theotokos is in the works of St. John of Damascus. I think he has the best description of the Theotokos. But I think that's one of the reasons why he never directly addresses her as mother. Because he's trying to prevent the idea of a celestial mother. And a celestial mother has just, how do I say this? Crazy pagan implications. To the extent that, even probably it would be crazy to possibly to the extent that if the Jews thought that Christians were teaching this, this would be stone-throwing incidents. Because, you do have that relationship between Baal and Balat, where still fresh in Jewish memory is the pagan god Baal and his female consort Balat. So I suspect here it's mostly to keep sort of clear the whole idea of that there's a God the Father, but Mary being his mother of the incarnation of the Theotokos, but not a celestial godlike mother. So I think that's really the reason here why we've got that sort of that why Yeshua never calls Mary mother directly. But it is an interesting question. I have never thought of it before. It is fascinating though. But there does seem to be an intentionality about it now that one starts to think about it. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. And I hope that answered the question. Interesting question. Okay. Linguist Ammo for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Good to see you here tonight. Hey, Dr. Falk, I saw your videos on the syncretisms of Abraham and Terah. If what drove out Abraham of Urkesh was war between... is what drove out Abraham of Urkesh was war between Hammurabi and Zimri Lin. Yes, I think that was really largely part of this. But it happens before then, okay? Really, what happens is what we've got from, say, the Mari letters is Terah of Urkesh is actually driven out because Terah of Urkesh is he's an agent of Zimri Lin. He's the agent of Zimri Lin and the kingdom of Mari. Now, the natives of Urkesh basically throw out Terah and replace the government with a government that is more friendly to Elam. We don't know the exact king of Elam at the time, but the war between Hammurabi and Zimri Lin happens after Terah's already driven out. Okay, so Terah is already driven out by the time Hammurabi overthrows Zimri Lin. Although we don't know how long that war did go on. It could have gone on for quite a while. Do we have much Let me just make a quick double check here of the correspondence here. Between Hammurabi and Mari. Here it. Yeah, so most of the correspondence between Mari and Babylon seems to take place during the 15-year reign of Zimri Lin. So what happens is, if we've set this chronology correctly, Terah of Urkesh is driven out by the Elamites. During this time, with the where Terah is now a Hapiru. He's a vagrant. He's a vagabond. Okay. He sends some letters to Zimri Lin. He sends some letters to Zimri Lin, basically reporting the loss of Urkesh, asking for some mercy. Hey, I'm a vagrant now. There's not much I can do for you. I try to serve you well. And, we have at least, I think we have 5 letters in total from Terah of Urkesh to Zimri Lin, 3 of which are legible, 3 of which have substantial writing on them. And then Hammurabi conquers Mari and defeats Zimri Lin. So it's not exactly because of the war between Zimri Lin and Hammurabi that they lose Urkesh, but it is more that Hammurabi takes advantage of the situation. Hammurabi is an opportunist. Okay? He's an opportunist. Mari and Elam are at war over Upper Mesopotamia. Okay? They're at war. They're both Elam, the Elamites, and the Mari people of Mari are both trying to get that influence over northern Mesopotamia. And when Mari starts losing its grasp on that northern Mesopotamian area, that Hammurabi basically sees an opening He sees an opening and then conquers Mari. He's like a shark. He smells blood in the water. Okay. Urkesh has changed hands. Other cities in northern Mesopotamia are changing hands. Mari's on the decline. Mari's now ripe for a takeover. And Hammurabi just moves right in. So anyway, I hope that explains sort of the historical context there. Thank you very much for that super chat. Very, very much appreciated. And I hope that answered your question. Thank you so very much. Okay, the Camelopard for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. How should Jeremiah 23:24 be understood in light of transcendence? Thoughts on Joshua 10 being dated to what? The 110:32 7 BC eclipse? Sneaky second question. I don't understand the second question. Yeah, I don't understand the second question here. There's something hinky about the date I don't get. Something about this date I don't get. All right, let's take the first question. I'll get the Bible up here and let's take a look at Jeremiah 23:24. Typo? Probably. Put the correct date in and we'll take a look at that. Okay. Let's go to 1st Jeremiah here. That would make a lot more sense. All right. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Correct typing is everything, yes. There's Jeremiah. Jeremiah 23:24. Okay. How should 23:24 be stood in light of transcendence? Okay. So essentially, in what way should it be understood in light of transcendence? Okay, so the verse says, we'll start with 23 here. Am I a God who is near, declares the Lord, and not a God far off? Well, that's sort of a rhetorical question. Well, yes. Am I a God who is near and not a God who's far off? Well, yes, he is a God who is near and not a God who's far off. But what does near mean here? Can a man hide himself in hiding places, so I do not see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill the heavens and the earth, declare the Lord? Okay, now this is one of the great verses that's used to make arguments for immanence. Basically, the omnipresence of God. Now, omnipresence has some certain theological problems associated with it, which is why of the omnis, it's the only one that's not been sort of universally affirmed. Now, granted, omnipresence has been taken in more than one way. Here's something we got to be really super careful about when we talk about omnipresence. Is a very nuanced subject anyway, because there's more than one ways to take omnipresence. There is the whole idea that God can fill the earth and say his potential presence. And yet, does he? Is he everywhere? In one sense, he knows it all. Now, one can quickly reject the argument that the other attributes of God, omniscience, all-knowing, and all-power, omnipotence, depend on his presence. Okay? God does not need to be present to actually know all things and to assert all power. I mean, I've heard it say that, well, if God's not there, how can he see? Because he has sight. Just the same way that human beings can be in one place and see at a distance. We don't actually have to be physically present to see. God knows all creation. He knows what we're going to do. He knows past and future. If this is a matter of God being present, then contingent futures become an issue. So it's more of a matter of that God already sees what happens because he has foreseen it. Because he's foreseen it, he knows it. So he doesn't actually have to be physically present to have his other omni abilities. Okay? But the thing is that the point of this passage is that you can't escape God. That's really the point of his passage. That he's there in the sense that he knows, he can hear you, he sees you. But he's not necessarily in all parts of creation in the same way and in the same capacity. And that's how we would understand transcendence here. Because one of the problems with immanence, with omnipresence, is it does collapse into pantheism. And this is a well-recognized problem in theology. I mean, it's not a problem for the Hindus, okay? Because Hindus accept that God is a pantheism. For them, the idea that God is everything is God and God is everywhere and God is in everything, that's no problem for them. That's common sense for a Hindu. It's more of a problem for the idea of a Christian God who is all holy. Okay, remember, we have to remember that the ultimate quality of God is his holiness. More than his strength, more than his power, more than his presence is his holiness. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. That's the preeminent quality of God. Holy means to be set apart. Set apart from what? Sin, transgression, iniquity, evil. If God is everywhere, in every atom, and fills every niche of space inside of everything, then God's in a lot of places that aren't very holy. And you've got to then ask, then the problem of evil really rears its ugly head here. There'd be no need for sacred space, because then all space is the same. That division that we see in the Bible of sacred and profane is basically, would then be moot. The whole idea that God separated out Eden would be moot. God making a sacred space in the tabernacle would be moot. None of that would make sense. It only makes sense because God is transcendent. So we have to understand the purpose here of Jeremiah 23 is to say that man cannot hide from God. That's really what it's trying to show you here. Not his omnipresence, but his omniscience. That you can't escape him. And what this is showing here is not his omnipresence, but his immensity. This is another term that theologians will use. That God is incredibly immense. And this is in many ways is that the idea of immensity is that God can fill every niche of creation if he wanted to. But he restrains himself. Doesn't. He pulls back from creation in certain instances so he doesn't exercise judgment. So, so when we take here, say, Jeremiah 23 to 24, what we're looking at here is not a statement of omnipresence, but of immensity. Immensity and omniscience. And that's how we would look at this through the light of transcendence. At least we were, while maintaining consistency with the rest of biblical narrative. So anyway, I hope that answered your question on that first question. Now your sneaky second question, which you finally basically tell us is the eclipse of October 30th, 1207 BC. Joshua? I think I know what you mean here. Joshua 10? This is about the sun standing still, if I best recall. You don't have a verse here. I think that's what you're talking about. Not correct. Yes, verse 13. Starting verse 12. Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel and said in the sight of Israel, O sun, stand still at Gibeon, O moon, in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. Okay. And there was, verse 14, there was no day like it before or after it when the Lord listened to the voice of man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Okay. Do I think that this was a solar eclipse? It's possible. But there's also other possibilities here too. I mean, it's been suggested that this is a cultic event. Many people have 1207 is a perfectly reasonable date for this, by the way. There's nothing wrong with this being around 1207. It could even be earlier. So the whole tricky thing about eclipses too is, they tend to be more regular than we give them credit for. So I'm not sure if 1207 would be the right eclipse. I would probably put the date of, say, of Joshua 10 earlier than this. I think this is a little late for Joshua 10. I would put the events of Joshua 10 around 1220. So I think this is about 13 years too late. Okay. So possible it's a solar eclipse. Is it likely? That's the $1 million question. I'm going to have to look into this a lot more before I make a firm statement of what I think this is. I don't necessarily think this is an eclipse. Because the sun doesn't stop in the middle of the sky for an eclipse. Okay? The sun keeps moving during an eclipse. So, I just don't think this is an eclipse. Yeah. Yeah. Barry, Kiara here reminds me that Barry Beitzel's interpretation that this is actually the longest day of the year. So that the battle, that what they mean here is that the battle lasted for an extra long day, essentially. So they had time to win it. So that's what Beitzel's interpretation of it is. But there's other people who've had other interpretations of it either, also. But I haven't taken a position on this because I haven't actually studied this in enough detail yet. But I find the eclipse theory to be dubious. Okay. Still possible, but is it likely? I'm kind of doubting it, that it's likely. Either way, if it is an eclipse, 1207 is too late. Yeah, I think it has to happen about at least 13 years earlier. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. I hope that answered your question. There's a lot of debate over this one. A lot of debate over this particular passage. And a lot of papers have been written on it. I just have yet to go through them all. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate it. Okay. Bible here. Okay, the next question. Here we go, from Tom Wanchek for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. And he says, I hope to be a chaplain when I retire from my career. Oh, that's a noble thing. Just be careful what school you go to. Okay. I have seen some dreadful chaplains. I've seen some very good ones too, though. Okay. I've encountered chaplains I wouldn't trust as far as I could throw them. But as I said, I've also seen some very good ones as well. And he asks, what's the best education for this? P.S. All should read Dr. Falk's Ark of the Covenant book. Tremendous. I just so happen to have it right here. So, here's thank you for the shout out for my book. We're very close to earning out on that book, by the way. I also want to thank you for purchasing that book. We're very, very close to earning out on that book. So if you need a Christmas present to give to somebody, please consider giving my book to them. It's got lots of pictures. Earning out for a book is really important. Most books in publishing don't earn out. And what we mean by earning out is that the publisher starts making more money than they gave you in advance. So, essentially, when you have earned out your advance, that's when you as an author start getting royalty checks, and the publisher is pleased as punch with you. Okay? Because at that point, you have shown that your book can earn money, that you are profitable as an author. And we are very, very close to earning out on this book, which was really surprising given when it was released. This also, if your book earns out, it also increases your opportunities to write a second book. You don't have to beg to write that second book. At least not much. The publisher is more likely to approach you and say, hey, you've earned out. Maybe you would like to write another book? Because there's nothing a publisher loves more than a profitable author. But we're not there yet. I think we're about something like 30 copies away from earning out, so we're really, really close to earning out. Haven't done it yet, but we're really close. So at the beginning of the year, we were 90 copies away. Now I think we're down to about 30. So I think we're really close to earning out. So if anyone does want to help out the channel, that's a great way to help out. Because we do want to write other books. We still have to find the other resources to write those books. But if I say, hey, I have a copy, a book that's already earned out, that has been successful, that's done well, then that gives publishers confidence. So again, thank you very much. Now, let's get back to your question. Best education for chaplaincy. Okay. There's two approaches you can take to becoming a chaplain. You can go the full theological education route to becoming a chaplain, or you can take a chaplaincy program. The full theological education, that's the equivalent of becoming of earning your MDiv, your Master of Divinity. This is the normal theological degree that is often given to people who would be in regular ministry roles, like pastors. They would normally earn an MDiv, and then go on work in a church and be ordained, etc. So that's one way you can become a chaplain, is you can get your MDiv and go into the chaplaincy program after that. Basically, you go directly, instead of going into, say, normal pastoral ministry, you'd go into do chaplaincy work. A lot of that's going to depend on your denomination, too, so you have to check with your denomination as well, what they require for a chaplaincy in your denomination. So that's probably where you'd have to start, is check your denomination. But within most denominations, there's sort of two paths to becoming a chaplain. One's the MDiv. The other is called just a chaplaincy certificate. And this is offered in, I know, for example, Vancouver School of Theology has a chaplaincy program. These are sort of like accelerated programs. You know, they're 1 to 2 years of theological education and practica, and you go basically, you take this postgraduate program like an MDiv, but about half the time, and then you become a chaplain after that. I have mixed feelings about chaplaincy programs. I'll be very blunt. I have very mixed feelings about them. I think a lot of times it leaves chaplains unprepared for, say, the challenges that they face. Unprepared theologically, unprepared emotionally. You have to deal with a lot of things as a chaplain. And I think the theological education is not just so you can minister to others. It's in some way so you can hold it together as you deal with that much grief. Okay? It's hard. Being a good chaplain is really, really hard. I think that chaplaincy certificates do a disservice to both parties. They do a disservice to both parties. Because the fact is, too, that chaplains often have to do preaching duties as well. Chaplains make terrible preachers. They make absolutely awful preachers. They usually don't know Hebrew and they don't know Greek. They don't know the languages. They can't write a proper sermon. They end up being very moralistic, topical sermons, and it's dreadful. No one's getting properly fed at a sermon done by a chaplain. Because a chaplain has to not only chaplains don't only sort of provide comfort to the sick, to the bereaved, but they'll do other things too. They have to do stuff like say preach at hospital chapels. So they oftentimes they have to baptize dying babies. They have to do things that call for deep theological and moral weighing. They have to do things that that are hard, really, really hard, and oftentimes they're not properly equipped to do that. My recommendation, if I know you're doing this as a retirement thing, I've known people who've done a retirement and done a full MDiv. I know it's possible to do. And frankly, most retirees do have the years to do this. So, a lot of people come out of retirement thinking they don't have many years left. Well, on average, your typical retiree is going to live for another 20 years. I think it's responsible to take 3 of those years and do a proper MDiv, be equipped, properly equipped, and then go out and be your chaplain. It's like kind of like Hebrews says, be workmen that are properly equipped so that you're not ashamed of the service. Be prepared. Yeah, but either way, it's a worthy thing to be a chaplain. It's a really worthy thing. And I think it's something you should pursue if that's where God is calling you to do. And a chaplain can be a wonderful, wonderful thing. Okay? It's hard. You need to be well equipped to do it. Emotionally, spiritually, biblically. So I would recommend an MDiv program for this. Okay? It might seem like overkill. Honestly, it might seem like overkill. It won't seem like overkill once you're in the trenches. It won't seem like overkill in the slightest once you're in the trenches. Honestly. So anyway, that's my advice. Thank you very much for the super chat. I very, very much appreciate it. Okay. Courtney Thompson for $2. Thank you very much for the super chat. What is your summary of the Trinity doctrine? Well, I can summarize this easily in like 30 seconds. The 3 persons of the Trinity are the one God. That's it in a nutshell. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Spirit is God. The 3 persons are the one God. Now, with that said, you don't have division between the persons. You don't have separation. Each person has its own distinct identity. It is a very, very difficult to explain etymologically. In fact, you cannot explain this with an analogy. Not without the analogy breaking down at some point into partialism or modalism. It's an incredibly difficult doctrine to explain with earthly analogies. There's nothing quite like it because the Trinity is beyond anything that we have experienced on this earth in any way, shape, or form. It's also not illogical or incoherent, but it is unique. And because it is unique, it cannot be explained easily, except through intellectual abstractions. And it's only through abstractions that it can be apprehended, but not comprehended. So I think that's my summary of the doctrine of the Trinity. The 3 persons are the one God. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it. Courtney Thompson again for $2. When do you date the orthopraxy of high Christology? That's a kind of an odd question. I don't think it's necessarily. I mean, you find high Christology in the Gospels. Okay. So I don't think this is something that you can date. It's not something that has the quality of being dateable, is insofar as high Christology is always it's part of the entire, say, Christian tradition. You find it in the Church Fathers. You can't read the Church Fathers without encountering high Christology, because the Church Fathers are all about what is Christ as he relates to the Old Testament. Those are matters of high Christology. As far as orthopraxis, orthopraxis is right doing. So I'm really not sure how that relates necessarily with high chronology or high Christology. So, well, that's orthodoxy. High Christology is a practice of, it is not an orthopraxis, it's an orthodoxy. Right belief. High Christology relates to belief, not practice. Orthopraxis is praxis. So it'd be, you know, yeah. I mean, high Christology itself dates to the gospel. So it relates to what we find in the Gospels and what we find in the Church Fathers. The idea of it being an orthopraxis is odd. It's a wrong category. It's a wrong category. You probably meant when do you date the orthodoxy of high Christology? That would make more sense. In which case, I would say that you find that right from the beginning. We find this in, say, even like early church fathers, like First Clement, Irenaeus will talk about this. Ignatius, has a lot of high Christology in it. So the fathers of the first and second centuries have high Christology in them. So you can pretty much at that point place high Christology, with the apostles themselves. So there is no doubt that you have high Christology in the Gospels. You have it in Mark, you have it in John, and really, even in Luke, you have it. So it's there. It's there and it's present. And if you want to date Mark to an early dating of Mark, there's some at this point. We got a few scholars that are dating Mark very early, earlier than I would date them. Like, for example, everyone sort of agrees that Mark's the earliest gospel. I would date Mark to the 50s. But, there's scholars today that date the Gospel of Mark as early as 35 AD. Now, the amazing thing is that scholar isn't even a Christian. He's an atheist. This guy's an atheist. And he dates Mark to 35. Yeah, but then again, ancient texts are ancient texts. But I think without any doubt, high Christology dates to the 1st century. And, goes on from there. So that's where I would date a high Christology. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated, and I hope that answered your question. Kwame Adu 007 for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Hi, Dr. Falk. Is it true that there's a temple relief of Ramses II fighting abnormally large warriors in the Levant? No. Ramses II in all his reliefs is massive. Okay. I'm going to be very blunt about this. Ramses II is portrayed larger than life. This is Egyptian iconography. Okay? When we talk about Egyptian iconography, the pharaoh is huge. He's a giant. Now we know from his mummy that he's not. Okay? We know that Ramses II was about 5 feet tall. Okay? He wasn't a big guy. We know, but his reliefs, Ramses is a giant, and he's slaying with the bow and arrow and killing Levantines. Okay, I don't know of any temple relief where Ramses II is fighting abnormally large warriors in the Levant. Okay, I've never seen this myself. Now, it might be there might be a relief out there where the warriors are, say, comparatively larger than other warriors on the battlefield. That's possible. I'm not aware of such a relief. It's possible that it could be out there. He did make a lot of reliefs. But in every relief Ramses did, he's the biggest guy on the battlefield. Okay, without doubt. Okay, he's always shown as the biggest guy. Okay, so now I think what you were referring to is here an allusion to giants. Now there is an allusion to giants in one of I think it's Papyrus Salier 1 if I'm not mistaken. It's one of the trade satires where it talks about giants, the Shasu being giants. And I believe it places them at about 6 cubits, which is about, I think it's roughly 9 feet. But again, this is a satire. It's hard to. I mean, there could be some exaggeration there. It is true that at the time of Ramses II, there was a belief that there were giants in the Levant. Okay, so that much is true, and it's a belief that we have evidence for during the reign of Ramses II. Okay. But that didn't come from, say, temple reliefs. That came from written literature. So I think there might have been some sort of mistake here as to where that source came from. But I'll be on the lookout for this now that it's been suggested. I haven't seen it myself, but might be. Well, the skeletal remains we have from the ancient Near East, from Canaan, are, I mean, everyone's roughly 5 feet.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is sort of one of the criticisms of the whole giant narratives, is that nobody has found skeletons of giants in Levant. But then again, too, we've got very few actual remains of, say, Philistines. Well, we don't know. I mean, we don't know a lot about, say, Philistine burials. I mean, Philistine burials are actually quite rare. We don't find a lot of Philistine cemeteries, for example. We don't know exactly why. There has been the suggestion that, for example, the Philistines might have cremated their dead. And if you cremate your dead, there ain't going to be much left. So, we are, in some ways, relying here mostly on written documents for this. Whether it's, say, the reports of giants in the Book of Kings and Samuel, or if it's, say, the Egyptian papyri, we're still dependent here on written documents. So anyway, that's probably the best I can answer this right now. But as far as I know, I don't know of any temple reliefs where there's abnormally large warriors in the Levant. I'd have to know more about the temple. If I know more about the temple, which temple it's in, I can probably look it up. To some extent, because I've been in many of the temples of Ramses II. So, by no means all of them, but a lot of them. At least the major ones. So I have like a photographic record of most of the temple reliefs in Egypt from Ramses II. So, if I know the temple, I could probably narrow it down. But without knowing that or where it is, it's kind of hard to track down. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. So anyway, with that said, thank you very much for the super chat. I know that probably wasn't as helpful, but again, I need more info if I was to basically track that down, and I don't know of any of these on the top of my head that are like that. So thank you so much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it. Okay. Angel WVM for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Can you help with an apparent contradiction? Okay. We can see how contradiction it is. Between 1 Samuel 15:35 and Samuel 19:24. I've heard possible solutions. I'm just curious about your thoughts on this. Well, it would help if you had told me what exactly you thought the contradiction was. Because apparent contradictions can sometimes be apparent to one person and not the other. They tend to sometimes be in the eye of the beholder. So this is something where it'd be really helpful if you had just given me a little more info, but let's try to figure it out. $35, okay. 1 Samuel 15:35, and Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, for Samuel grieved over Saul, and Saul, the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Egypt. Okay. And then 19:4. And he also stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, laying down naked all that day, all that night. Therefore, say, is Saul also among the prophets? Okay. Okay, so I think I see the. When did Samuel last see let's go to 15 here. 15, 5 again. So Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. Of course, whose death? Context here, but verse 33. And Samuel said, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. Samuel healed Agag pieces before the Lord of Gilgal. Then Samuel went to Ramah. But Saul went up into the house of Gibeah at Saul. And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. And there's lots of notes here. So check. Cross-reference a physical Bible here, or I might get the notes. Just because that might be helpful here. 1 Samuel. And this one's not annotated, so this doesn't help. Right. And Samuel did not see Saul again until his death, for Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted he had made Saul king over Israel. And then let's go back to 4. It's 18. Samuel at Ramah. Trying to figure out something here. Do we have the death of Samuel? Okay. Death of Samuel's in 1 Samuel 25. It's interesting. I would probably have to look a lot more into this before Saul's death. Well, that could be it, yeah. That's very likely it. Samuel. $1535. That might be an interesting thing too. Could be a lot of play on words here. This is an interesting passage. First of all, whose death? Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death. His here is ambiguous. Is it Samuel's death or Saul's death? That'd be very, very different here. Samuel grieved over Saul. Because if it's over Saul's death, then you then have a issue then in, and then the other thing is, what does it mean to see? If, for example, in 1 Samuel 19, Saul comes and prophesies before Samuel, was Samuel blind by that point? He was already in his old age. There's a lot of things that I think could be said here. But I'd like to look into this a little more detail before I say anything actually definitive about this. If it's referring to Saul's death, then it could be a reference to the Witch of Endor incident. Well, I mean, this is long before then. This is long before then. So, yeah, we know Samuel dies before Saul. The question is, who's seeing whom in 19? In 1924, Saul steps off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, laying down naked all day and all night. Therefore they said, is Saul also among the prophets? Verse 20, then Saul sent messengers to David, but when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing and presiding over them, the Spirit of God came over them upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. So, there's going to be some question here of what do we mean by see? What do we mean by, who died? So it is a difficult passage. It is a difficult passage, but it's also, I don't think, one that's irreconcilable either. But I just haven't looked into this one long enough or in detail enough to really give you a definitive answer on this. I'd have to go into commentaries at this point and take a look. And I'd also have to go into the Hebrew itself. So I don't have any prima facie thoughts on this. This is the first time I'm actually looking at this. It's an interesting question. Yeah, it's a very interesting question, but it's not something that I've looked at very, very strongly. In fact, I've never seen this one before, honestly. So that's always interesting. So that's the only answer I can give you at the moment. Not without looking at this deeper. So anyway, great question. Absolutely great question. It's something for me to look into, and I'm actually looking forward to exploring this one deeper. So anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Sometimes questions are like that. Sometimes you go down and you get something, you learn something, and that there's something more here to learn. So thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for the super chat. Okay. Okay, the Camilla part for $2, sponsoring Barnabas Lawson's biblical presence question above. All right. His question is, has the Bible been preserved throughout history? Has it undergone intentional changes by later scribes? That's actually a yes to both questions, believe it or not. Okay. The transmission of documents in the ancient world is very complicated. We have more texts of the Bible, the books of the Bible, than any other document of ancient history. Bar none. Bar none. We have thousands of New Testament documents. We have hundreds of Old Testament documents. It's the best. It's for any ancient document, we are talking hundreds to one in terms of copies. And the one thing we have learned through all those copies is, yes, there are changes. Little changes, little mistakes, some intentional changes, but also a core consistency. And we can figure out where the changes occur because there are so many copies. And because there are actually so many mistakes, we can also figure out, hey, these are mistakes, these aren't. This is the job of textual criticism. It's to basically sift through these thousands of documents and figure out where the changes occur and where they didn't. So we have actually instances where scribes change things. Probably one of the early on, for example, grammar had been updated. Grammar and spelling had been updated in, say, the Old Testament to reflect the presence of vowels. These are the Mater's lectionis. Basically, a certain consonants were added to some words to show that there was a vowel present. Now, later on, say in the 10th century AD, the Masoretes are going to add their own vowels through special pointing. What's called Masoretic pointings. But until the Masoretes, the only vowels that were in the text were those added, by those early revisions. We do find some scribal glosses, where a later scribe will come in and add a little detail to the biblical text. Now, they don't change the biblical text, but they add a little bit just to explain it. We also find that, like, for example, the Masoretes will also do what's called Kativ and Kare writings, where they will make a change, they'll mark it, and have both what's they call the Kativ, the text as they received it, and their change, called the Kare, which is what they think it should have read. Okay? And the interesting thing about the Kativ and Kare is the Masoretes don't change the underlying text, but they leave it to you to figure out. Do you go with what's written or what should be spoken? Kativ written, Kare spoken. So ultimately, they're going to leave it to you. Previous scribes, were not always so thoughtful about how they did their changes. So we do find a lot of most of the changes we find are basically variations in spelling, typos. We do see some homoarcton and homotelutin, which is basically, some texts have pieces that are chopped out by mistake. So we do find that there are errors that have crept in. But again, the blessings that we have by having so many manuscripts is that these are often very, very easy to figure out. For example, the New Testament, we can figure out 99.9% of what was in the original manuscripts, just because of the huge number of documents we have. Old Testament is a little more difficult. We're down to 95%. Okay? But still, that is pretty darn good, considering what we have for other texts of the ancient world. I think something like the Lives of the Caesars, I think we have like 6 copies. It's just really sort of very, very, some of these texts are, in the case of the New Testament, some of those New Testament documents are less than 100 years from the original text. Like the Papyrus 52 in the Rylands Library. I think that dates to about, I think it's 80 years after the writing of the original gospel it's based on. So it's really recent in comparison. So I think that we also have to keep in mind too that in many respects, there is a propinquity between many of the manuscripts we have and the original manuscripts as well, especially for the New Testament. Not so much for the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the chronological gap is a lot larger. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Old Testament, too, has a greater challenge for textual critics, because there is such a wide gap between the earliest writings of the Old Testament, which are around the 13th century BC, and the earliest complete documents we have. So there is a quite chronological gap there that we have in the Old Testament that we don't have in the New Testament. So, but even so, we can look at, say, the text families that we have for the Old Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which represent many text families. The Masoretic text type, the Septuagint, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, and even that, we compare those texts, we do see that there's much more of the text that remain intact than underwent, say, permanent changes. What we don't seem to find is wholesale revisionism. Okay? Any of the scribal changes that were made were generally very small. Very, very small. We don't even see, say, changes, a lot huge names, huge changes in stuff like place names. Now, this is not to say we don't find place names being updated, but once they are updated in the text, they do seem to be ubiquitous across all the texts. So we do see that the texts do seem to be remarkably well preserved. For an ancient text that has been copied consistently over 3,300 years, oh yeah, remarkably well preserved. Has it had scribal changes too? Yeah, it has had that as well. But we can also figure out where those changes are, just because we have so many texts. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. I want to thank the Camelopard for sponsoring that question. Very, very, very much appreciate that. And I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for that question. Okay. Mouthwash for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. Do the foreign gods people brought in 2 Kings 17 correspond to the 5 husbands of the Samaritan woman? No. I can see where you'd get that. He says there are 5 peoples who settle in Samaria, but 2 of them have 2 gods, making 7 in total pattern. Yeah, I think you're overreading it here. No, I think the 5 husbands of the Samaritan woman were quite literally 5 men. I don't think they correspond to, say, the 5 groups in 2 Kings 17. I don't think there's any symbolic meaning here. Because the fact is that the Assyrians brought not just those people groups, but all sorts of people groups from all over the Assyrian Empire into Samaria. So it wasn't just those 5 groups, but it was those 5 groups plus. But I think here, yeah, I think you're seeing a pattern here that's not there, honestly. Okay. They are in the case of the Samaritan woman. Those are literal men. Those are literal husbands. And the last one's not her husband. That's the other point too. Is she gets the writs of divorce from the first four, and the last one is more of a live-in than a husband, because there's no writ of marriage. So, yeah. So, I think we have to be a little careful here, not to um, over symbolize what's happening. Okay, and so yeah, I don't think. And the fact is, too, to be very, very honest, the Samaritans weren't pagans. We have to be very, very careful here, too. Samaritans weren't pagans. They were Yahweh worshippers. Okay? They were not pagans. They were Yahweh worshippers. They worshipped Yahweh on Mount Gerizim. Frankly, you can actually go to Mount Gerizim today, and there's still Samaritans there who are doing sacrifices to Yahweh. They're still there. They're still sacrificing to Yahweh. Okay? But they're not worshiping pagan gods at Mount Gerizim. They're worshiping Yahweh. It's a kind of aberrant Yahweh worship, in that it's not being done at Jerusalem. Okay? But it's still Yahweh worship. So they're not worshiping other gods. They're not worshiping other gods. And they're never accused of worshiping other gods. This is why, say, the gospel starts in Judea and Samaria, and then into the world of the Gentiles. Okay? There's a reason for that pattern. Okay? The gospel goes from Judea to Samaria to the Gentiles. Why? The Jews first, Samaritans next, being next in line, because they are descendants of the northern tribes. Yes, they're mudbloods at this point. But, to use a Harry Potter term, they're mudbloods. Half-breeds. But they're still northern Israelites. Because they're northern Israelites, they're next in line after the gospel spread to Judea. So to Judea, Samaria, and then the Gentiles. That's because they're still Yahweh worshippers, not idolaters. So anyway, I hope that brought some light on that. Thank you very much for the super chat. I very much appreciate it. And the Samaritans are a very interesting group. Very, very interesting people. Very fascinating. Very few in number today, though. Very few in number today. Yeah, Islam was not merciful to the Samaritans. But they are still there. They're still there on Mount Gerizim. I think there's all about 500 Samaritans left. Very few Samaritans. But they're still there. And they're still sacrificing. So anyway, thank you for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, Allayco for $5 Australian. Thank you very much for the super chat. And he says, Shalom, Folkers, and everyone. Well, Shabbat Shalom to you, too. Good to see you here tonight. I don't see a question here. Really appreciate the greeting. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. I don't see anything below here from him. So I think it is just a greeting. Well, I very much appreciate it. We very much appreciate every super chat. It has not been a very good financial month for us, so we do really appreciate it. Every super chat is very, very helpful for us. As I said, it's been a lean month with both work and, well, the fact is that, having to take the flu, time off for the flu is time I'm not getting paid. So We are running a little short, so we do appreciate all these super chats. It very, very, very much helps us make ends meet. So, very much appreciate this. Thank you so very much. And I think got one more super chat here, and then we'll go into the non-super chats. What's the takeaway for $5? Thank you very much for the super chats. Good to see you here tonight. Very much appreciate you joining with us tonight. And he asks, what archaeological discovery or series in relation to the Exodus could cast doubt on the plausibility of the Exodus? Oh, wow. I don't know. I don't think there's one discovery that could put. I mean, most of the time when I hear, say, critics of the Exodus, it's almost always an absence of evidence argument. If I like for example, I listened to recently Bart Ehrman's critique of Titus Kennedy and Sean McDowell, and Titus Kennedy goes, there's no evidence of that direct evidence that would contradict the Exodus, only an absence of evidence argument. And Bart Ehrman pipes in, but wow, what an absence of evidence it is. Well, that's sort of what you get when you hear about doubts upon the plausibility of the Exodus. Is, yeah, okay, an absence of evidence is nothing at all. It's not evidence for, it's not evidence against. It's nothing. A big absence is just a big nothing. It's just a big nothing. It's not for, it's not against. It's, I mean, the bigger the absence, the bigger the nothing it is. It's just, it's atrocious historical reasoning. Atrocious. Now, that I don't think there's an absence of evidence. I think we have a lot of evidence for the Exodus. I think we also have our biggest problem with the plausibility of the Exodus is cutting through the interpretation. There's a lot of bad interpretation associated with the book of Exodus. A lot of bad interpretation. Cutting through that interpretation is, wow. People cling to their interpretations like hanging on to a life raft. The fundamentalists will hang on to an aggrandized Exodus because that's what they were raised with and they have no other view. The atheist clings to an aggrandized interpretation of the Exodus because without that, they have no basis for criticism. Both are clinging to an aggrandized version interpretation of the Exodus, which is wrong. It's just a silly kind of, here's the thing. I've heard this said before, and it just drives me nuts whenever I hear this. Oh yeah, the hail came down, destroyed all the barley, and it wiped out all their food, so the Egyptians starved. And I just shake my head at this, because the Egyptians didn't eat barley. Yes, they grew barley. They grew barley to make beer, to purify their water. They ate emmer and wheat. This is one of the reasons why vitamin A blindness was so rare in ancient times in Egypt, because barley is vitamin A deficient. Other cultures in the ancient Near East ate barley primarily and had suffered from essentially vitamin A blindness. Barley, what they call barley blindness, but not in Egypt. So, the hail wiping out the barley and the flax crop didn't affect the food supply. It affected the water purification cycle. That's a very different thing. Of course, going without beer, now that's tragedy. Come on. Not the beer!
That affected the morale.
It affected the morale, yeah. But no one starved because the barley crop was destroyed in Egypt. And it drives me nuts when I hear these atheist clowns go, "Oh, it destroyed all the crops and they were starving in Egypt and all their food was destroyed." And no. I mean, the text explicitly says it didn't touch the emmer or the wheat, because it wasn't yet grown. It's these lunacy interpretations that really affect, people's perception of the Exodus story. So, you're not arguing at that point against the biblical text. You're arguing against people's perception of what they think the text actually says, not what the text says. It's bizarre. But if you're just fighting against, a backwards, upside down interpretation, yeah, you can find all sorts of stuff that'll contradict that. I mean, there's no end to craziness that you can have if you've got a whacked interpretation. Oh, well, where did the Israelites, get clothing out in the Sinai? They had sheep. Think about it. Oh, well, where did they get the fabric? A loom. Well, where do they get the wooden the sticks and the stones? You're kidding me, right? You're joking, eh? Sticks and stones, right? You mean there's no sticks and stones in the Sinai? Uh-huh. The fact is, though, that they could have still brought it with them from Avaris, packed up their loom anyway. I mean, you just deal with these ridiculous objections when it comes to the Exodus, and it all boils down to really, I mean, most of it, 90% of it. 90% of the objections to the Exodus are really based upon a bad interpretation of the Exodus. Like, for example, even in what you would think is normally well-read scholars, like Israel Finkelstein. I mean, he recognizes that if there's any possibility of an Exodus, that it happened in the 13th century, but then he goes, well, it's inconceivable that the Exodus, that there was an Exodus, because they would have to fight across, they would be crossing the north of the Sinai through the road of Horus, and fighting all those fortified areas. And it's like, wait a minute, Bible doesn't say they went across it. In fact, the Bible says exactly the opposite, that they avoided that route because they would face war. Like, did he read the text? Do any of these people read the freaking text? Tell me how yeah. Kiara just piped in. Tell us how you really feel about this. Read the text! You're making us look stupid. Read a book! And this is coming out of the mouth of Finkelstein. Did he read the text? Bart Ehrman is now supposed to be trying to teach on the Exodus. It's like he's forgotten the entire story. He's forgotten the entire text. Like, really? Read the text. Not that hard. And it's not just them. It's not just the atheists. It's the early daters too. They don't read the text either. They don't read it either. I'm gonna take that comment here. Camel leopard. But that requires word looking. Yeah, well. What's the takeaway? Best $5 I've ever spent. Well, I'm glad you got your money's worth. I mean, really? Come on, guys. I mean, we're supposed to be the top of the academic field. We should have at least read the book. Come on. Oh boy. So, anyway, you've got how I feel about this whole subject. So, and plus your money's worth on top of it. So, I think I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much for the super chat. Oh boy. Alright, let's go to some non-super chats here. Because I think I'm getting tired and punchy. As I say, I'm still recovering from the flu here, so... I'll take this one from Bible Exegete here. And he writes, in what century would you place the finishing of the Pentateuch? Okay. I put the sort of the editorial polishes on the Pentateuch to the roughly the 10th century BC. Okay. Now that is later than the Mosaic period. So here's how I think the development of the Pentateuch took place. I think during the 40 years in the wandering in the Sinai, Moses basically wrote his papers. But I think they were sort of a loose collection of papers. And I think guys like Joshua added a couple to them as well, such as the death of Moses. Okay. So I would say that during the early United Monarchy, basically the time of Saul, David, and maybe even Solomon, although I'm much more likely basically Saul and David, that the papers were sort of then organized into books, and that a scribe basically put linking passages between the papers. So essentially taking the papers of Moses and then adding basically linking words or linking phrases to make it a complete narrative. So anyway, I think that process was roughly finished around, as I said, the 10th century. But at the time when Israel had its first kings. So, and that's really, because we do get those editorial glosses at that time. There was no king yet in Israel, which infers that this, at least though, that editorial comment had to take place during the time when there was a king. So, Anyway, I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the question. Very much appreciated. Let's see here. Well, I'm going to take another non-super chat. Kenneth Vaughn asks, I think he's talking about Ramses II here. Was he short for the average Egyptian at the time? No. Even though Ramses II was about 5 feet tall, he wasn't particularly short for an Egyptian at his time. He was about average, maybe a little taller. You had a lot of Egyptians that were 4'10", 4'8". So, he wasn't short, not for an Egyptian. That's the quick answer to that one. Chow asks, what was the average height of a Bronze Age ancient Near Eastern person? Around 5 feet. 5 feet is average. Swiftsy asks this question. This is an interesting question. This may be a broad question. It is. But when you compare the story and religion of the Old Testament, is there a difference when compared to other religions of the ancient? Yes. I would say this. The story and the religion of the Old Testament is very, very different than other religions of the ancient Near East. Now, and this is the respect where I think it's very different. When you look at, say, more historical documents of the ancient Near East, they don't separate their religion from their history. So, in a sense, all historical documents in the ancient Near East are also religious documents, but they're not theological documents, and they're not mythological documents. Let me clarify that. There's a difference here. Okay? When you look at, say, ancient Egypt, you'll get like the contentions of Horus and Seth. This is a religious, mythological document. But when you talk about the Battle of Ramses II, the Battle at Kadesh, that's a historical document with religion used as points of explanation. Like, for example, when Ramses is surrounded and he has to fight the Hittites alone. He says that, Amun-Re descended down upon him. He was filled with the spirit of Montu, and he, fought ferociously like a lion. Okay, he's using religious imagery here and ascribing his success to the gods. When you look at the works of the Old Testament, in comparison to the other religions of the ancient Near East, they're much more like historical documents, and we can even call this religio-historical documents, because they do combine both. There aren't any purely historical documents for the most part in the ancient Near East. Most historical documents have an element of religion of some kind. the Old Testament reads a lot more like this sort of religious historical genre that you find across the ancient Near East than it does, say, mythological texts. So, in some respects, you do have overlap between, say, mythological and historical texts. For example, Genesis has much more, say, mytho-history than it does than you find in, say, historical texts generally. At least the first few chapters of it. But it's a lot less mythological than, say, you would find, for example, Enki and his magic hoe, or Marduk versus Tiamat, or Enuma Elish. So there is definitely some differences here. But the vast majority of the Old Testament corpus is much more in line with, say, historical documents we find of the ancient Near East, or, say, wisdom and literature, wisdom of prophetic literature. So we have to be sort of careful here when we do compare the Old Testament to other ancient Near Eastern religions, because sometimes we got to be careful not to compare apples and oranges as well. So I think that there is some difference there, and I think there is also points of comparison that we can make with other, say, more historical texts as well. This doesn't exactly preclude. This is not to say that the Old Testament is entirely history. It's not entirely history, but it does have a historical element, and the way it's written is more like historical with the intervention of their god. And that's more along the lines of historical documents in other ancient Near Eastern contexts than it is with, say, the religious texts of other ancient Near Eastern cultures. So it's a very interesting sort of divergence that Israelite religion goes down that path. It's the more historical religious path than it does down the mythological path for its religion. Very interesting. By the way, I hope that answered your question. Thank you very much for the question. Very interesting question. Okay. It is. It is an interesting point. Let's see. I see a double question there. That's a no-no. We won't ignore that. I have Christopher Larson. Okay. Take this here. By Gizbo SBOL. Why do you think the Merneptah Stele mentions Israel rather than the particular tribes Merneptah encountered, since Israel is still divided into tribes? Probably because when he encountered them, they identified themselves as, say, when they asked him, what kind of people are you? They probably told him, sons of Israel, Israelites. That's probably why. Probably what came out of the interrogation. Because when Egyptians, when they went and on campaign, they would interrogate the various people. That's how they found out where they were at. You take a few people of the village, you interrogate them, they tell you information about the local area, and the scribe writes it down. And that's how Merneptah figures out he's fighting Hurrians, one tribal group, and that's how he finds out he is fighting Israelites, because he captures some and interrogates them, and they basically say they're Israelites. So they wouldn't necessarily identify strongly with the tribe. What's one of the things we have to understand, too, about, say, tribal affiliation as well? Tribal affiliation is actually pretty weak. We also find this in modern. This is not exclusive to Israelites. Tribal affiliation is probably the weakest sort of affiliation in the whole thing. Okay, I mean, you got national affiliation. Then you got tribal affiliation, the clan affiliation, and then you got the clade, and then the nuclear family. The tribal affiliation is in some ways the weakest affiliation. Their affiliation to their clan is the strongest. Most Israelites are going to say, I'm of the clan of such and such. You ask them, well, that's not going to mean anything to an Egyptian. So what? You're part of clan such and such. Who's he? Well, he's a member of a different clan. Well, what are you together? Okay. So, in that encounter, there might have been a half dozen clans there. Or more. Merneptah is going, are you anything else other than it? Oh, yeah. We're Israelites. That's going to be the next sort of tier of what they would consider themselves. And then, if he had pressed it further, they might have said, oh, well, we're such and such tribe. But we have to understand that when it comes to clan politics, the tribal leader had almost no power. The leader of the tribe has almost no power. It's almost a figurehead. It's almost a figurehead position. So when the tribe leader, does a call to war, the clans have the option of saying, yeah, we're going, or we don't. All the decision making in a tribe is at the clan level. So the tribe itself has not that much power. And the tribe leader has no power, essentially. He's more of an organizer. He's a community leader. Okay? He's a community leader. Let's just all sit together and decide. Yeah, I mean, a tribal leader is nothing but a smarmy community leader. I mean, that's what he is. Maybe a little more than that, but essentially that's what he is. He doesn't have any authority. Clan leaders have authority. Clan leaders can decide to go to war or not. But the tribe cannot. A tribe leader cannot make anyone go to war. This is what happens, actually, when it comes to the tribe of Reuben. When Deborah calls the tribes to help fight, and the tribe of Reuben sits around debating. This is what's going on. Is the tribe leader can't force the clans to fight on Deborah's behalf. So each clan is basically humming and hawing, saying, "Yeah, I don't really want to do this one." And the clan leader, or the tribe leader, can't make them go to war. Okay, so as far as Merneptah is concerned, the only thing that unites these clans is Israel. So that's why he identifies them as Israelites, because that's what they're going to report. So, that's essentially the answer to the question here. So anyway, thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting question. Okay. Yeah, let's make a last one here. One more, and then we'll call it a night. I think everyone's tired. Hmm. I'll take this one from Brick Creation, and this will be the final question of the night. It just came in too. Brick Creation asks, talking about judges, I heard that Jerubbaal was a common name during the time of Gideon. Was it really common to call someone Baal contend? No. No, it wasn't. Okay. Yeah, it means let Baal contend with him. This is not a name you give someone. It's not a name you give a child. Okay? This is a name you earn. Okay? We do find in the Hebrew scriptures that there are names that do not necessarily reflect the person's birth name, that are done as commentary, that are done tongue-in-cheek, that are done to display higher spiritual truths. Nabal, the guy who refused to give provisions to David's army. Nabal means fool. No mother names their kid Nabal. Okay? No mother names their kid Jerubbaal. Okay? Same reason. No. Nobody names their kid Jerubbaal. Let Baal contend with him. Let Baal deal harshly with him. Now, what kind of mother's that? Yeah, one who doesn't like the father, apparently. No, not a common name. It's not common at all. It's a very strange name. And this is one of the reasons why I'm more than half given to think that the Jerubbaal ostraca is. Oh, I can answer that question too. I'll take that as a supplement. Wonder why they said it was a common name. So they don't have to attribute it to Gideon. Essentially, that's the reason. If you say it's a common name, then you can say, well, obviously it's not Gideon. It's not the same guy. It's a common name. Well, the problem is it had never been discovered prior to that ostraca. Not that common of a name. It's not like we find it in the seal texts. We got a lot of them at this point. So, it's not a common name because, frankly, it has. I mean, there are names that are very, very common. That we do find in the biblical texts. Jacob, very common name that we find extra biblically. Menachem, very common name we find extra biblically. But Jerubbaal, no, not so much. Not so much. Yeah, it's just, nobody would name their kid this. It's like name your kid God Hates You. Yeah, boy named Sue, exactly. Yeah, it's the equivalent of naming your kid God Hates You. You know, um, it's just like in the book of Ruth, Ruth's two original children, Milcah and I forget the other one. That meant sickness and misfortune. um, really, that was really their names? No, that wasn't really their names. He's tired and filled with familiar spirits. Yeah,
It's
I'm filled with the flu and iced tea, but I wish it was familiar spirits. Mm. No, it's iced tea tonight. Blueberry iced tea, but iced tea nonetheless. But no, it wasn't a common name. Jerubbaal was not a common name. Um, it's I don't know where they get the idea it's a common name. Uh, but it's again, it's the equivalent of naming your kid God Hates You. So yeah, I don't think any mother would be given this name intentionally. This is a name that somebody earns, and that's where Gideon gets it from. Where he wrecks a statue of Baal, an altar of Baal, and the townspeople go to his dad and says, "Control your son." And the father goes, let Baal contend with him. Jerubbaal. So it was an earned name. It's not a name you would ever give a kid. It just isn't. So anyway, that's going to be the final question of the night. It has been a long and a very interesting night, and we went for almost 3.5 hours here, so I'm tired. Anyway, I want to thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I want to thank all the super chatters who have helped us out. We really appreciate it. I want to thank all the live chatters that gave us some great questions. And I will also want to add my thanks to the Patreon supporters who this week got a very, very special thank you, which was a sneak peek of our vampire video, which will be coming out Monday on Halloween. We also want to remind everybody that about the upcoming debate between myself and Titus Kennedy on November 7th at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time on Sean McDowell's channel. And we're also thinking about having an after party following it, where we do another live stream, and we might even open that live stream up to people come in and talk. So we're actually going to be making something special out of this. So anyway, I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight. I want to thank our subscribers, and please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our content. With that said, you guys have a great night. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.